Here is a fact that nobody disputes. Walk into almost any hotel in the world, New York, London, Toronto, Sydney, take the elevator, and press the button for the 13th floor. You can't. Because it isn't there. Not labeled 13, anyway. That floor still exists in the building. The concrete is still there. The plumbing still runs through it. People sleep in rooms on it. But officially, institutionally, that floor does not exist. We've accepted this. We've normalized it so thoroughly that most people no longer even notice. A child riding an elevator might ask, well, why does it go from 12 to 14? And the adult, half laughing and embarrassed, will say, oh, 13 is unlucky. But why is it unlucky? That's where this story begins, because the more I looked, the more I realized that the answer to that question isn't superstition. It's strategy. Before we can understand what was erased, we need to understand what existed. 13 is not an arbitrary number. It's not some random cultural mistake. The erasure of 13 from buildings is only the most visible layer of something much deeper. Pull back far enough, and a larger picture starts to emerge, not just from architecture, but from calendars, from music theory, from the very structure of Western timekeeping. For thousands of years, across civilizations that had no contact with one another, the number 13 held a position of deep significance. Not feared, not avoided, honored. Consider the lunar calendar. The moon completes roughly 13 full cycles in a single solar year. 13, not 12, not 14. 13 lunar months fit within a year far more naturally than 12 do. And yet nearly every dominant timekeeping system in use today is built around 12 months. We have 30 and 31-day months precisely because someone had to stretch the math to make 12 work. February sits there, awkward, truncated, a patch job, the arithmetic scar of forcing a 12-month system onto a 13-month reality. The Maya track 13 as a foundational unit of their sacred calendar, the Tzolkin, a 260-day cycle built from 13 numbers cycling through 20-day signs. This wasn't decoration. This was astronomy. This was extraordinarily precise timekeeping. When you understand that the Tzolkin accurately predicted Venus cycles, solar zenith passages, and eclipse seasons, you have to ask, why would a civilization of such mathematical sophistication choose 13 as a base unit unless 13 actually worked? The Aztecs, the Egyptians, the ancient Celts, the Norse, the indigenous peoples of North America, 13 moons, 13 cycles, 13 nodes on the turtle's back, which, in several Native American traditions, was used to count the lunar year. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Think about what it takes to remove a number from a building. Not one building, not one city, thousands of buildings, tens of thousands, hotels, hospitals, office towers, airports, all following the same convention, all skipping the same number simultaneously, consistently, across different countries, different languages, different cultures. And here's the strangest part, no one ever issued a formal decree. There is no law requiring buildings to skip the 13th floor, no international architectural standard, no signed document. The coordinated silence has been deafening. We're told this happened organically, that individual builders, architects, and hotel managers all independently decided, based on the general public's superstition, to renumber their floors. That raises a simple but critical question: when in history has a superstition ever produced that level of standardized, coordinated, and sustained behavioral change without some organizing force behind it? Look at airplane seating. Many airlines skip row 13 entirely. The official explanation is passenger comfort, people won't want to sit there. But this logic collapses. These same airlines pack passengers into middle seats, remove legroom, charge for water, and routinely stuff humans into aluminum tubes with the comfort of livestock transport. They're not optimizing for comfort. They're optimizing for something else. Airports. Formula One racing, for years, no car bore the number 13. The 1976 season is particularly striking to anyone who looks closely. NASCAR has had extended periods where 13 was simply absent from the roster. Not retired in honor of a great driver, not reserved for a sponsor, simply absent, as if the number itself had been quietly walked out the back door while everyone was looking the other way. The pattern repeats. It accumulates. And accumulation is where superstition stops being an explanation and starts being a symptom. Let's go deeper. The ancient Egyptians recognized 13 stages in the soul's journey towards spiritual ascension, 13, not 12, not 10. Their cosmological framework, the Assyrian mysteries, included a 13th component that represented transformation, the threshold between states of being. The 13th was the moment of becoming. In Sumerian cosmology, one of the oldest literate civilizations we know of, tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia reference numerical systems that treated 13 as a cosmic pivot point, the number at which cycles completed and renewed. These tablets predate the Old Testament. They predate classical Greece. And yet almost no one outside narrow academic circles has studied their mathematical framework. Why? The deeper I went into the historical record, the more I noticed not just what was present, but what was missing, gaps in the scholarly literature, translations that glossed over certain numerical references. Prominent cuneiform scholars have noted, in footnotes, always in footnotes, that certain numerical passages in recovered tablets resist conventional interpretation. What does that mean? It means the numbers don't fit the system we're using to read them. The official explanation collapses here. Not because the tablets are damaged, not because the scribes made errors, but because our interpretive framework was built around different numbers than the ones the original culture was using. Consider the ancient Greek and Roman pantheons. The Greeks had 12 Olympians, or so we're taught. But in several recovered preclassical sources, there are references to a 13th figure present at councils, present at foundational mythological events, and then quietly written out, absorbed into another deity, renamed. The scholarly consensus treats this as mythological evolution. But what if it's editorial revision? What if someone at some point decided that 12 was a cleaner, more manageable number, and removed the 13th? Not addition, not revision, not natural mythological drift, removal. Have you noticed any of this yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I've spoken to architects. I've spoken to historians of mathematics. I've spoken to cultural anthropologists who study numerical symbolism. I've spoken to people who've spent their careers studying the intersection of number systems and social organization. And in almost every case, not all, but almost every case, the response to questions about the systematic removal of 13 from modern numbering systems was the same: a slight pause, a small smile, the words, "Oh, that's just superstition." And then movement to the next topic, as if the question had been answered. As if superstition were an explanation and not merely a label for something that hadn't been explained. Let me spend some time here, because this is the cornerstone of everything else. The 12-month calendar is not natural. I want to say that clearly, carefully, and with full awareness of how strange it sounds. The Gregorian calendar, the system that governs virtually every nation on Earth, that determines your work schedule, your tax deadlines, your holidays, your entire temporal orientation, is a 12-month system built on a 13-month astronomical reality. The moon does not complete 12 cycles in a year. It completes 13. If you track the moon from full moon to full moon, a lunation, it takes about 29.5 days. Multiply that by 13, and you get 383.5 days. The solar year is 365.25 days. The math doesn't divide cleanly either way. But here's what's telling: the 13-month lunar calendar requires fewer corrections, fewer adjustments, fewer leap day patches than the 12-month system. And yet the 12-month system won. Globally. Completely. Without serious competition for the past several centuries. Who benefits from a timekeeping system that requires more maintenance, more correction, more centralized management? Think about that. The 13-month calendar was not theoretical. It was used. The Ethiopian calendar still operates on 13 months, 12 of 30 days each, and a 13th short month of 5 or 6 days. Ethiopia is one of the very few nations that never fully adopted the Gregorian system, and it is one of the very few nations where 13-month time remains lived experience rather than historical curiosity. Worth noting, Ethiopia is also one of the few nations that successfully resisted colonial conquest. Coincidence? I'm not saying it isn't. I'm asking whether it's worth examining. The ancient druidic calendar operated on 13 months, each named for a tree, each corresponding to a lunar cycle. The Coligny calendar, a Gaulish bronze artifact discovered in France in 1897, one of the longest surviving documents in a Celtic language, shows a sophisticated lunisolar timekeeping system that incorporates 13 as a fundamental unit. It was, by every archaeological assessment, a calendar of high precision. The Roman Empire encountered it, and within generations of Roman consolidation in Gaul, the druidic calendar was gone. Not adapted, not absorbed, gone. But if you replace the calendar, if you impose 12 months and tell people the old system was primitive, pagan, superstitious, then something interesting happens. 13 becomes strange. 13 becomes the number that doesn't fit, the number that doesn't appear on the standard clock, on the standard calendar, in the standard building directory. And the human mind, which is extraordinarily sensitive to pattern disruption, begins to register 13 as an anomaly. Not dangerous because of anything inherent to it, dangerous because it was made to stand outside the system. The fear of 13 is not a fear of the number. It is the psychological residue of a deliberate, systematic exclusion, a trained aversion, an engineered absence. Now, I want to talk about the mechanism, because erasing a number from architecture is one thing. Erasing it from consciousness is another. And to do that, you don't just remove it. You have to make people afraid of it. You have to take something that was once sacred and make it feel wrong, dangerous, cursed. The most commonly cited origin of 13's bad luck is the Last Supper, 13 people at the table, with one betrayal to follow. But here's what's rarely discussed: the Last Supper narrative was recorded and disseminated through institutions that were simultaneously replacing indigenous calendrical systems with the 12-month Roman model. The same institutional force that promoted the 12-month calendar was the same force that codified the story of 13 as the number of treachery. I'm not claiming causation. I'm noting correlation. I'm asking, is it remarkable that the number which most threatened a 12-based institutional system was the number that got assigned a narrative of doom? The fear of 13 even has a clinical name now, triskaidekaphobia. We've medicalized the avoidance of a number. We've given it a Greek etymology, a formal diagnostic framework, academic papers analyzing its prevalence. The number has been so thoroughly pathologized that fearing it seems rational, and not fearing it seems naive. That raises a simple but critical question: at what point does a superstition become so systematically reinforced that it functions as policy? Because when airlines skip a row, when hospitals skip a floor, when racing circuits eliminate a number, they're not acting on personal belief. They're acting on institutional convention. And institutional conventions don't emerge from superstition. They're engineered as if following instructions they didn't fully understand. One of the strangest features of this story is how abrupt the transition was. Cultures that had used 13-based timekeeping for generations, in some cases millennia, switched quickly, with remarkably little documented resistance. The historical record of this transition is thin, not because it was gradual and unremarkable, but because the documentation itself appears to have been subject to the same editing process as the calendars. The Aztec calendar system was documented by Spanish missionaries immediately following conquest. Those same missionaries oversaw the burning of Aztec codices, the books in which astronomical knowledge was recorded. We know from the missionaries' own letters that they burned what they called books of the devil. We know those books contained calendrical and astronomical information. We do not know precisely what those books contained, because they no longer exist. Not lost to time, not damaged by weather or war, burned deliberately. The Library of Antioch. The books of the Druids, which Julius Caesar himself acknowledged as sophisticated and extensive, gone. The Library of Alexandria, not fire, not neglect, gone. In each case, what survived was curated. What was preserved was selected by someone for reasons. The deeper I went, the more I found that what we call the historical record is not a record at all. It's a selection. And in that selection, 13-based knowledge systems appear with striking rarity, not because they were rare, but because they were not the systems that those doing the selecting wanted preserved. The silence was deafening. Here's what I keep coming back to: a number doesn't disappear by accident. A timekeeping system doesn't get replaced globally through coincidence. A superstition doesn't achieve architectural and institutional consistency without organization. What we are looking at, when we look at the systematic removal of 13 from floors, from calendars, from rows, from racing numbers, from cultural consciousness, is the standardization of perception itself, the enforcement of a particular cognitive framework. A 12-based world is a world that divides differently, measures differently, thinks differently than a 13-based one. 12 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, and 6. It's a bureaucrat's dream, a number optimized for division, for taxation, for measurement, for control. 12 inches in a foot, 12 months in a year, 12 hours on a clock face, 12 items in a dozen, 12 members on a jury. The architecture of modern institutional life is built in 12s. 13 doesn't divide as cleanly. It's prime, indivisible except by itself and one. And here's the strangest part, that indivisibility, that resistance to clean division, may have been precisely what made it sacred to older cultures. A number that cannot be broken down, a number that cannot be divided and controlled, a number that perhaps resists the kinds of systems designed to divide and control people. I'm speculating. I want to be clear about that. But the pattern of what was erased and what was promoted suggests not arbitrary cultural drift, but a deliberate preference for systems that enable management, measurement, and standardization over systems that preserve older, more organic cycles. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The traces remain. They always do. The original Great Seal of the United States, still printed on every dollar bill, is saturated with 13. 13 stars, 13 stripes, 13 arrows, 13 leaves on the olive branch, 13 levels on the unfinished pyramid. The founders who designed it were scholars of classical history, of ancient languages, of esoteric traditions that had not yet been fully erased. They appear to have known something about 13 that the dominant culture of their era was actively suppressing. And they encoded it anyway, into the official symbol of a new nation. Why? The unfinished pyramid with its 13 levels and the all-seeing eye above it is one of the most debated symbols in American iconography. And almost none of that debate focuses on the number itself. We argue about the eye. We argue about Masonic influence. We don't argue about 13 because 13 has been so successfully framed as unlucky, as superstitious, as beneath serious inquiry, that its deliberate inclusion in a founding document doesn't register as significant. The evidence suggests something much larger than a coincidence. Ancient temple complexes across Mesoamerica are built with 13 levels, 13 terraces, 13 steps to specific ceremonial platforms. Chichen Itza's El Castillo pyramid casts a shadow during the equinox that creates the illusion of 13 triangles descending the staircase, 13 at the precise astronomical moment when the solar year turns. As if the builders encoded a calendar into the architecture itself, a 13-based calendar that the structure would demonstrate every year automatically, without maintenance or explanation. Who were they speaking to? And why did we stop listening? I began this investigation with a simple observation, that a number had been removed from buildings, and I expected a simple answer: superstition, cultural habit, nothing more. What I found was a thread. And every time I pulled it, more came loose. A lunar calendar replaced by a solar one. Sacred astronomical knowledge burned, buried, or simply not preserved. A number that ancient cultures across 6 continents treated as foundational, systematically reframed as cursed. An architectural convention with no legal basis that nonetheless achieved global consistency. Institutional systems, aviation, medicine, hospitality, sport, that quietly enforced the removal of a number with no formal agreement and no public conversation. Not superstition, not coincidence, not gradual cultural evolution, but a pattern. Precise, persistent, and remarkably coordinated across centuries and continents. That raises a simple but critical question: what would we know about time, about cycles, about the natural world, about ourselves, if we had been allowed to keep counting to 13? What knowledge lives in the lunar month that the solar calendar can't hold? What understanding of natural cycles, biological rhythms, agricultural seasons, was encoded in the 13-month frameworks that were erased? What does the human body, synchronized to a moon it evolved alongside for 100,000 years, lose when its culture stops counting the moons? I don't have the answer. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most effective erasure isn't the one that destroys knowledge entirely. It's the one that makes the question itself seem ridiculous. That makes people embarrassed to ask, makes scholars reluctant to publish, makes architects skip from 12 to 14 without a second thought, because everyone knows that 13 is just unlucky. Just an old superstition. Nothing to see there. The official explanation asks us to accept that the coordinated, cross-cultural, institutionally enforced disappearance of a number is the result of nothing more than accumulated folklore. I find that explanation requires more faith than the alternative. And the alternative is this: that someone, at some point, understood that the way a culture counts time shapes the way that culture thinks. That a people synchronized to lunar cycles, to 13-month rhythms, to the indivisible prime pulse of the natural world, are a people connected to something that resists management. and that disconnecting them from the calendar, from the count, from the number itself, was not incidental to the project of standardization. It was the project. The deeper I went, the more impossible it became to see this as accident. And now you've seen it, too.